Hi, this is Jim Manzi. David, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks, Jim.
Great. Well, we're here at Blogging Heads to discuss David Orr's new book, Down to the Wire. As an introduction, my name is Jim Manzi. I am a software entrepreneur and a blogger at a number of places, including The Atlantic, The American Scene, and National.
And I am David Orr, professor at Oberlin College, located just southwest of Cleveland, Ohio. Teach environmental studies and work from the president of the college.
Great. Well, David, maybe the right way to start is I will ask you to give a summary of the book and thesis. I'm holding it up right now in front of the camera so everyone can see it and know how to go buy it. It is called Down to the Wire. And David, why don't you take it away and let people know what the book's about?
The book is about climate change. The title really tells the tale. The title Down to the Wire suggests that we're going to come very close to events and circumstances that we won't like. The book is divided into three parts. The first part is a statement that the issues are fundamentally, they've gone long enough and far enough to be fundamentally issues of governance and ethics primarily. And this is not to dismiss the importance of technology or economics, which are clearly part of the overall effort. But the thesis is that we've extended this our response to climate change far enough that we already have courted significant changes in the Earth and the circumstances in which we live. So we've raised the temperature of the Earth 0.8 degrees centigrade. That's already been done. We have in the pipeline another roughly half a degree to full degree centigrade warming. That's already been done, although we haven't seen the results of that yet, which means that we'll come very close to a 2 degrees centigrade warming of the Earth compared to the pre-industrial era. And that makes the Earth hotter than it has been in quite some time, probably for the last 600 and some thousand years, perhaps even longer. So what this means is that the market won't solve this. It can be part of long-term solutions. Technology can't save us from the consequences of what we've already done, although it's going to be very important to contain the long-term effects of climatic change. So this makes it an issue of governance, what James Howard Kunstler calls a long emergency. It's a convergence of a number of different issues and crises, including the end of the era of cheap fossil fuel and terrorism and population expansion. We're already at 7 billion and growing. And so the issue is, the book is basically an argument or an explanation of why this is fundamentally an issue of governance, not of economics, of ethics, not necessarily first and foremost of technology, as important as those things are. So that's the book in a nutshell.
Great. I read it, and the audience may have seen when I held it up, I have all kinds of yellow stickies on certain points that I really thought would be interesting to discuss. And I would encourage anybody to read it. It is. I read it as a polemic, but a passionate and incredibly interesting one. One of the places I thought maybe to start is you talk a lot in the early parts of the book about what you see as the likely or potential consequences in human terms, economic terms, health terms, and others, of the likely effects of climate change that we will see as driven by human emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Mm-hmm. It was. I wrote a cover article for National Review a couple of years ago, and I think the first sentence was something very close to, conservatives need to stop denying that this is a problem, that there's science that's known, and we really have to address this. It seemed to me, however, that when you really look in detail, at least at what the UN IPCC, which is, as you know, but for the audience, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the large body of several thousand scientists who won the prize and so on. That create really, I think, the best, the most definitive picture of our technical knowledge around this subject. And when I read in the book, you describe a picture of, for the United States, what you think the country will look like. And in this one part, you say the following. Sea level Sea levels will eventually inundate coasts worldwide, including U.S. cities such as New Orleans, Miami, Charleston, Washington, Baltimore, New York, and Boston. We may choose to protect some with dikes, but those would be hugely expensive and probably doomed to failure if global temperatures increase much beyond 2 degrees centigrade. In that situation, the more likely scenario is that millions of people will be forced to leave their homes or property and move to higher ground. But it is not just the people living along the coastlines who are at risk. One plausible scenario is a Grapes of Wrath-like exodus in reverse. Long lines of vehicles clog the freeways heading east towards the Mississippi and north toward Oregon and Washington. Is it your take that that's in some kind of foreseeable timeline, likely that's your reference case or expected case, what you think will happen? Are you describing an outer edge of a distribution of outcomes? Is that a good picture of the way you see America, what you see America looking like if we don't change?
Well, two comments. One is the public dialogue about climate and the scientific discourse about the issue are separated by a Grand Canyon of and there's no way to bridge that disparity, at least at this point. So, staying on one side of that chasm, just reading the scientific literature, what does climatic change mean for the United States in particular? When the first three IPCC, or actually the first four IPCC reports came out, the fifth is in preparation. The assumption was the cryosphere, all the ice on the planet stays essentially frozen. Mm-hmm. And we now know that that's not nearly as true as once thought. Nature magazine several issues ago ran a story on the accelerated melting of the Antarctic and also the Greenland ice sheets. We've known since about 2005 are moving much more rapidly than had been thought even a few years ago. So what's gone from a 40-centimeter increase in sea level by the year 2100 now is probably the consensus is more like 2 meters by 2100. Well, 2 meters takes out New Orleans and Miami and large chunks of the eastern seaboard. Mm-hmm. And the rise, Susan Solomon in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in January talked about a 1,000-year period in which sea levels continue to rise just because of what we've already done. And right. So this is the hardest thing to think about for governance because we are people of short time spans, instant gratification. We think of a month or a year or electoral cycle of 2 to 4 years, and now we have to begin to plan and think for periods of thousands of years and begin to understand what our actions imply for time spans that are quite otherwise unimaginable.
I'd love to come back to exactly that question because it's that topic of how we think mm-hmm. about those long time spans is one I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I've relied on IPCC integrated documents, the assessment reports, right. As not absolute truth, but the best reference we have to understand mm-hmm. Our current projections. I think if I use the fourth assessment report, the most right. recent completed one, what you're describing in the book, and it may be that we can project that the next integrated report will be a very different point of view. Mm-hmm. But I think that the current IPCC report, or to your point, the most recent completed one, there's ongoing work. Really, when I read it, it seems to me that it doesn't really project within the next 100 years, which is not the next 1,000 years, certainly within the next century. It doesn't really predict effects like this that are widely described in the literature and so in the public discourse. They actually, it's fascinating because in the IPCC report, they give a list for each of the major continents of here's an illustrative list to give you a sense of what climate change impacts will be over the next century, which is not to say over the next 1,000 years, the next century. So their list for North America is the following. This is from the Census report. Warming in western mountains is projected to cause decreased snowpack, more winter flooding, reduced summer flows, exacerbating competition for overallocated water resources. In the early decades of the century, moderate climate change is projected to increase aggregate yields of rain-fed agriculture by 5 to 20%, both important variability among regions. Major challenges are projected for crops that are near the warm end of their suitable range. Cities that currently experience heat waves are expected to be further challenged by an increased number, intensity, and duration of heat waves during the course of the century, with potential for adverse health impacts. Last, coastal communities with habitats will be increasingly stressed by climate change impacts interacting with development and pollution. And, it seems to me that, it's always seemed to me as I've spent time getting into this, that that all sounds pretty serious to me. But it sounds nothing like, an army of Joes, escaping the interior, dust bowl to arrive at cities that are underwater. And so, is it that what you're trying to do is lay out a picture over a much longer time than a century, or is it just, you're pretty convinced that the science has moved on since 2007 and we now have a different picture, or am I just misreading, what they're saying?
A little bit of all the above in a way. And you have to, when you think about climate change, we really don't know. I mean, we're discovering this almost every day, that there's something else we hadn't thought about. But what's clear is that we're dealing with nonlinear systems where 2 plus 2 all of a sudden is 8, 10, or 20.
Yep.
And the case of ice is a very good example. Estimates of the melting of Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets were way off, apparently, even as late as a couple of years ago. And now we know that that's moving much more rapidly. So we're dealing with nonlinear systems. Secondly, we're dealing with systems where the consequences of what comes out of our smokestacks and tailpipes is felt 30 or 40 or 50 years later. And so we're seeing the effects, apparently, presently, of things that we did back in the late 1970s. Thirdly, I don't, in drawing from the scientific literature, one of the problems with IPCC is that this is a consensus document. Mm-hmm. And it is written by scientists who are usually, by profession, and understandably so, very cautious about what they say. And so the day that the fourth IPCC report came out, many of the participant scientists agreed that it was already obsolete because the information had already moved well past the content of that report. So how bad will it be? There is good evidence to believe that, for example, storms are getting larger. We know that. That's simply part of the record from the 20th century. We know that storm surges are getting bigger on coastal hurricanes. We know that droughts are beginning to show up and last longer in many places around the world. So the kinds of things that I described are simply taken from the scientific literature. Mm-hmm. And you have to put a big caveat there. There's a lot here we don't know that we're going to discover as we go forward. But the strange thing for governance, and this really is a governance issue, is how do we anticipate long-term consequences and take preventive action or action sufficient to contain the worst of what could happen in advance of the crisis itself.
Right. And, I think that one of the things that seems to me to make this an extremely difficult problem to think about is you have the expected case of what we think will happen, and obviously the needle's moving around all the time on that as science advances and we learn more, and it bounces around in lots of directions. Mm-hmm. Second, even at a given frozen moment in time of best available understanding, to your point, our knowledge is pretty far from comprehensive about the global ecosystem, and so there's always this wide distribution of possible effects, and we can't only think in terms of the most likely case. We have to think about much worse and less severe cases, and in a sense, think about the distribution of probabilities that we face, and further recognize that our probability distribution itself doesn't capture all the information. There's true uncertainty, just things we just don't know. And if one were to accept for the moment, I'll take the current IPCC report as being the best frozen in time moment understanding of what's likely to happen. I think that it's very difficult to make the case that if exactly at the midpoint of the probability distribution of what is expected, you take a mid-case reference scenario, you take a mid-case set of climate impacts, as the IPCC does, you translate it into economic impacts, really you're talking about maybe a 3-degree increase centigrade in temperature by the end of the century. They've said a 4-degree increase centigrade in temperature translates to like a 1 to 5% reduction in GDP. So, again, for the moment, taking the expected case, you're well past 2100 before you're reducing GDP by 3%. That is an incredibly simplistic way to look at it. But I think that if you take that as that's the expected case, and then you start to odds adjust it, and they've done a huge amount of this. They've built probability distribution. I think on a kind of nerdy, I think probably in your view blinkered and narrow-minded cost-benefit analysis, it becomes very hard to me to rationally justify severe reductions in income and so on today in order to avoid that probability distribution outcomes over the next 100+ years. And,
you're
and so I'd like to hear you exactly. I'd like to hear you explain why that's. I think you will tell me that that's a too narrow way to look at it, and I'd love to hear why.
Well, lots of reasons, I think, and it's a really good question. Thanks for putting it that way. Economists have a bad track record on this particular issue. And Nicholas Stern, in the Stern Review, and then the book he's published this past spring, which is even more severe than what he put out in 2007. Nicholas Stern lays the case out, I think, about as well as a conventional neoclassical economist could do it, that preventive action is, in fact, worth a great deal. And there comes a point of no return where there's nothing really that you can do to stop this. So, the heart in the human body is maybe, a couple of pounds, whatever the heart weighs, 2 or 3 pounds or whatever, which is a small fraction of the total body weight. Yep. And so you could make the same argument that, you could lose the heart and not impact health. And again, with nonlinear systems, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see food interruptions or a convergence of several different kind of things, a technological event, a variety of different things that could occur that spiral into uncontrollable circumstances. And that is a particular poignant issue after the economic collapse that began a year and a few months ago. We now know that complicated systems can ramify and simply move out of control. So in the issue of climate change, the scientists on one side seem to be telling us that 2 degrees centigrade warming is a threshold beyond which we don't want to go. And trying to understand what happens to the right of a 2 degrees centigrade warming as you go to 2.2 and 3 and 4 degrees centigrade, this is a pretty rough thing to understand. Mark Linus' book, 6 Degrees, is probably the best popular analysis we have of what happens at each increment of global warming. And the assumption has been, I think, among economists in particular, reading their What I Do of Economists, that in fact this will be a smooth transition. It just gets a little bit warmer, that there are no such things as step-level changes or points where things seriously come undone. And that's not the world in which we live. It's a world of sudden and abrupt changes. And the scientific evidence about climate change is that it does change abruptly. That's simply the geologic record. When it does shift, it is often it shifts in a matter of decades. So the question for us is, how much insurance would we want to take out? And then there's another question also. We're assuming it's there's a lot of the economy that ought to be preserved, and the economy is actually working pretty well. We adjust a few things and have more regulation, and it's actually a pretty good economy. I don't think that's true. It hasn't delivered real happiness to people who are affluent. It has not distributed basic services and necessities to the bottom billion who are desperately poor. And so there's a good bit of room for rethinking the economy relative to long-term human presence on the earth. So this is an excellent time, given economic collapse and climatic change, to rethink a lot of old assumptions that don't seem to be working very well.
You and I share a kind of deep skepticism about claims to knowledge that academic economists make. so we have a lot of common ground there. I think that, I'll just mention in passing something you talked about, which is the Stern Review, because it actually relates closely to a couple of other points. The Stern Review, you can actually reconcile the conclusions of the Stern Review, the conclusions that argue, like the Nordhaus and other modeling efforts, which are often counterposed with the Stern model. You can reconcile them literally just about exactly by discount rate. In other words, that if you take the low social discount rate assumed in the Stern Review and you use more traditional discount rates, you actually get the same neoclassical result you do from Nordhaus and others. And that'll come back to the point that you were raising, I think, at the end, thinking of it in the very long term. If you think about, though, if I ever read back your argument and you tell me if I've got it right, which is, well, yeah, we can do all the work we want trying to translate 2 degrees or 3 degrees or 4 degrees into economic impacts, but we don't really know because we don't really know the fundamental nonlinear dynamics which might lead to much more radical physical changes to the environment than we currently anticipate at those degree changes, and that's a heck of a game to play, with our future. And so I totally get that. And I think you put it the way I would often put it, which is what we're doing is essentially buying an insurance premium, right? We're paying an insurance premium to buy insurance against this kind of deep and unquantifiable uncertainty. And so as you think about that, if you were offered, a choice to buy insurance here, and to give a stylized example, you were offered a choice of I either let, with no intervention beyond what will happen in business as usual, climate change happens, it's going to happen, or I can pay an amount of money to completely avoid any deleterious effects of climate change. Do you have a break-even price? I mean, is there a price above which you'd say, you know what, I'd rather roll the dice and take the damage?
A different way to think about this is simply we try to compress this into economic thinking, and I don't really understand that. You and I wouldn't get into a car, I expect, that had one chance of a fatal accident while we were in the car of 1 in 10, certainly, 1 in 100, certainly, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. We wouldn't do it, and we wouldn't ask the economic question. We wouldn't put that as, well, what are so many years of my life worth to me economically? The other thing is there's an assumption in this that climate, what we would do to prevent the worst of climatic change, in fact, comes to us as a cost, not as a benefit. And so economists look at how much this costs, but not what benefits we get on the other side, and also what Nicholas Stern said, that if we wait too long, we simply wouldn't be able to pay for the damages. It would simply spiral out of control. Now that makes it something other than an economic question of what I'd be willing to pay. And then if I say, okay, now this is a question that also ought to be asked and posed on behalf of future generations. So what's their life worth to us? And this is where the use of discounting gets into serious problems. A discount rate of above zero discounts the possibility of future catastrophes that may not fall on us, the decider, but fall on the deciding generation, but fall on our children and grandchildren.
I agree that actually all of the issues you're describing make this a complicated question to answer. But I guess to take your analogy of getting into the car, every time I get in the car, I am taking the risk of dying, actually. Yeah. And the more expensive cars, I can pay more money to buy a car which is safer and has many other advantages and disadvantages, but it's safer. And people consciously and unconsciously do not spend more money on cars that would be safer. And so we do make these trade-offs all the time. And it seems to me that if I ask as a premise, how much would you pay? So there's some possibility you wouldn't have to pay anything. Let's just accept that that's true. It might be that there's ways of living that are just superior. They're better in terms of climate impacts. They're better in all other ways. But if you had to give up economic consumption, and we can define that as broadly or narrow as we want. This can be a dollar sum or a percent of GDP. What I'm trying to get at is, do you believe this is so serious that there is literally no price that we should not be willing to pay to do this? Or if we, thinking through as hard as we could, we realized it's going to cost the following amount of lost consumption to avoid climate change damage, that price is too high. Is there a price that's too high?
Who gets to decide this?
I totally agree.
If you put that question to people at, say, the Tuvalu Islands or low-lying areas that are now looking for new homelands because rising seawater as a result of our emission of heat-trapping gases, you get one answer: my homeland is priceless. Don't change my living circumstances. If you're to ask future generations, let's say 2 or 3 generations out, when the worst of what we can foresee might come down on their heads, they would say, look, you pay whatever's necessary, but don't destroy my life or my happiness or my property or my even chance of living.
Right.
So this is why I say that this is not fundamentally an economic issue. This is a political issue. Because the question of who decides, not how they decide, but who decides, is fundamentally one of governance. And it's not a matter of my willingness to pay. I might come up with one number, but the people whose lives are directly impacted right now. And certainly if you ask, the World Health Organization says that something like a 250,000 people die every year because of climate change-driven weather events. Let's ask them. The people directly in harm's way because of our behavior. So I think trying to pose this first as an economic question gets the cart and the horse in the wrong relationship. It's first an ethical and governance issue. And then secondly, once you decide what's the right thing to do, then you say, okay, what's the smart way to go about it? So,
I'm with you. You know, I think that one of the things that I really agreed with in the book and feel strongly about is you go to great lengths to make the point that the idea of private property and property rights are not some metaphysical abstraction. They are the result of an evolutionary process which, in certain contexts, created a set of rules which lead people to thrive and prosper and get the things they want.
right.
And I think actually as a libertarian, too many libertarians don't really understand that. They view them as this kind of metaphysical good that transcends time, place, and environment.
That's a really good point.
And so I think that if you want to answer this much more broadly, the question I'm trying to get to here, I get what you're saying. Who gets to decide and how we do that is really undergirds any economic assumptions. What is money? What is price? What is value? Is undergirded by a whole bunch of political decisions. Mm-hmm. So I guess an alternative way to ask this is, you've written a book in which you've argued that people ought to, and governments and individuals ought to behave in a different way. And I assume that's, strongly, that's because you believe they would be better off. The collective, across lots of people, would be far better off. And what I guess I'm trying to say is if you don't want to answer it in dollar terms, that doesn't make sense to you, and I understand that. Is there a limit to the amount of coercion you would recommend? Is there a limit to the political action you would say, that political action is so severe that the cure is worse than the disease? Is there any point at which we would get to a cure worse than the disease?
The second chapter of the book gets into this, and I think it is possible for us to delay action so long that we would be forced to do things that we otherwise would never want to do. And so this is a challenge right now for governance, and certainly for the Obama administration and political leaders all over the world, to take action to prevent the worst of what could occur so that we don't have to do things that we would never want to do. Mm-hmm. And so the second chapter of the book is long, late evening thoughts about democracy, and I hope democracy survives. But we're putting civilization under an incredible stress. That's simply the scientific evidence, and there's some quarrel, and we don't really know exactly when certain things would happen, but we can see a long-term pattern unfolding. That means, and when certain things begin to happen, and underscore something I said before, certain things begin to happen, it won't be the markets that save us. It will be governments that will be called upon to intervene, to rescue people in Katrina-like circumstances, or droughts in the Midwest, or if you have to abandon certain parts of the country, for example, the Southwest, Phoenix, one study, Jim Powell's book, Dead Pool, says that the Phoenix area essentially will have to be abandoned, as previous civilizations once abandoned parts of Arizona and so forth.
Right.
But those become issues of governance, and things can get out of control.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the human record. We can wait too long, and at that point, nothing saves us. There's no technology that would rescue us. There's no government that could rescue us, and so early action on climate change is absolutely essential.
Yeah. Humanity's history is a litany of folly. There's no question. So to ask this yet another way, I guess I understand. It was a great chapter of the book, by the way, and a great title. I understand the descriptive prediction that the objective circumstances which allow democracy to operate may no longer exist, and descriptively that may lead to inevitable pressure which destroy democracy. But normatively, I guess another way to ask my question is, what degree of sacrifice of democracy, if any, do you think would be worth it now in order to forestall these risks of unforeseen climate change, or do you not see it as worth doing that?
That's a great question. And my argument is, or my response is, that in large measure, a good bit of the crisis has come from a lack of democracy, not too much democracy. A lack of transparency, not too much transparency. Too much money in politics, too much plutocracy and autocracy, not too much democracy. So I think that there's a good case to be made that, in fact, we've arrived at where we are, partly because of failures of governance in the past, and failures, frankly, of democracy. But having said that, I think you can imagine let's say, a sustainable, hyper-efficient, solar-powered, but fascist society. Mm-hmm. I think that's not a far-fetched thing at all. So I would hope that climate change responses occur with a democratization of the country, increasing control over the ways we provision ourselves with food, energy, water, materials, shelter, and the basics of life. More control, not less.
Mm-hmm. And what are some, and you go into this in the book, it'd be great to have you describe it, what are some reasonably specific, concrete, political level reforms that you would advocate today to try and get the best of both worlds, which is what you're describing?
Well, short of miracles, the things that we know we can do are get money out of politics, for one thing. Federally fund all elections. Number two, the biggest change for me would be, the second biggest change for me would be to essentially enforce the fair and balanced provision of the Federal Communications Act of 1947. And the public airwaves are being corrupted by unbelievable lack of balance in the information that goes out to the American public. There's a very sizable segment of the airwaves that are the commons that you and I and are public property that are serving up misinformation and distortion, if not outright lies. And in the case of climate change, the public doesn't have nearly the scientific background and sophistication that one would hope they would have coming through a public schooling system. Mm-hmm. And so people are vulnerable to misinformation. But those are two changes I would make as quickly as possible. Restore some kind of balance in the media, and secondly, get money out of politics. Create the same separation between money and politics that we ostensibly have between religion and politics.
Right. There's, I think, without doing too much damage to your argument, I think you're saying if only people knew the truth and were empowered to act, mm-hmm. then they would fundamentally support the general direction of things that I David Orr, am trying to propose. So let me tell you why I'm actually not convinced by the case, and we can talk about it. And it's not what it might seem on the surface. Right? So let me, without, again, doing too much damage to the basic gestalt of the book, here's the way I'd put it. What you're saying more or less is, look, you have a bunch of people, humanity, walking up this hill, and uphill's better and better, and they're looking down at their feet, putting one step in front of the other, and you're saying, look, just look 20 feet ahead, you're about to walk off a cliff and die. And you feel like those in power who are making money off each step of the way are like, well, no one rid me of this troublesome priest, right? It's just like, look, I mean, you're going to destroy yourselves, right? Uh-huh. And I guess again, that's a gross oversimplification. It's the feeling I got. And I get it, by the way. The way I would extend this sort of silly metaphor is to say that the way I see it is, we're those people walking up the hill, and there are a far set of guys looking and saying there's a cliff up there. But there are other people saying, actually, there's a canyon, and on the other side of that canyon is the uphill continues, and we need to build an airplane. And other people are saying, actually, we're not in two dimensions. We could go off to the left. There's a different path. And other guys are saying, well, there's these big clouds out there. And what that indicates is there's fire there, so we need asbestos suits if we go that way. And other guys are saying, no, those are rain clouds. We need a boat, And then some guys are saying, well, gee, cliffs and fires and boat, why don't we just stay where we are? And other guys are saying, no, the clouds are coming this way. No action is not an alternative. In other words, I think that we live in an environment of constant, unanticipated, and difficult to predict threats arising. And that the problem with irrevocable commitment to one course of action predicated on one risk is that you make it much more difficult to deal with other unanticipated risks arising. And as much as we want to address this one potential challenge, which in fact is not the expected case, while science is not this going to happen, it's a risk that will happen. But I can come up with lots of risks. And there are contradictory things you would do to try and address one set of risks versus another. And so in that situation, I think that the right thing to do is maximize your options, hedge your bets at all times, and have the ability to react to threats as they arise. So tell me what you think is wrong or in fact, not inconsistent about that point.
To the scenario you described, I just want to go back.
Exactly.
Back home or something. Here's the answer I would give, and two parts to it. One is that if we could see this in a historical sense, this is rather, perhaps like the Civil War in U.S. history, or the Progressive era, or the era of the New Deal. Clearly, we had to deal with changing circumstances. And in our circumstances, the most important issue is to price carbon, get the price of carbon right, or begin to take carbon seriously and energy efficiency seriously, and begin to deploy a very different kind of technology, but using the power of government to help move these things. So this is if you put our era into kind of historical context, it's clear, I think to me at least, that this will require a lot of political inventiveness, not the least of which is to give rights to future generations so that their interests are part of our decision making, that there are things that we can do that would deprive them of life, liberty, and property, and so forth. And that's the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Second answer I'd give is this. I don't think, I think I agree with you in principle. You don't want to lock ourselves into a course of action that would be deleterious if some things didn't occur as predicted. So this means in Wendell Berry's, the writer Wendell Berry's wonderful phrase, solving for pattern, that if we can devise resilient solutions and solve lots of different issues with single solutions, this is why energy efficiency and renewable energy in particular are so important, because they solve lots of other problems. If we get fossil fuels out of our energy mix, it makes our air cleaner. It relieves us of dependence on Middle Eastern oil. It stops the degradation of mountains in West Virginia that are being devastated, and improves human health and creates jobs and so forth. So it solves lots of different things. But this requires a very different approach to governance again, that we create governments that can solve for pattern and can understand the complicated relationship between lots of different phenomena. So the content of a resilient society, I think it is rather like what you've described. It's a society that's the supply lines are relatively containable, that people have access to better technology and economic reasons to deploy that technology, but to begin to create a far more resilient society in lots of different ways, not the least of which would be local food production, for all the reasons that Michael Pollan and other students of American diet and agriculture have said. So I don't think it's sackcloth and ashes, certainly not hellfire and brimstone at this point, but it's beginning to envision a world that works, that is mostly off-the-shelf kinds of things. We know how to, can you make buildings powered by sunlight? Sure, we've already done that. On our campus, the Lewis Center is still, I think, the only entirely solar-powered building on a U.S. college campus. But we know how to do those sorts of things. Can you grow local foods and provision ourselves with primarily locally grown produce? Yeah, that's a sustainable agricultural revolution. So I agree with the principle of resilience. You don't lock yourself into courses. And this is one of the reasons why I think nuclear power is, by and large, a really bad choice. It takes a lot of money. It's very expensive. And once you've built it, you're locked into a facility that takes 50 years, and then you've got to store the waste for 250,000 years or some such. And so I think we ought to avoid those things that lock us into courses of action we may, or our children may have good reason to regret later.
I get that. And let me sort of try and expand the frame beyond kind of energy, climate issues in terms of risks we face, right? So last year, the cover of Atlantic magazine was on the risk of killer asteroids, right? Mm-hmm. Which sounds like a kind of wise ass kind of, let's come up with a crazy threat, but it's the U.S. federal government spends a lot of money on detection systems because pretty serious scientists are worried about this. There's certainly a record of giant asteroid impacts, which probably kill off the dinosaurs, not a lunatic risk. Because of the complexity of celestial mechanics and the number of objects out in space, it's really not a quantifiable risk. But it would threaten the entire survival of the species. And so, I think that it makes sense. It makes sense for us to spend some money on it. I don't think I would say there is no price beyond which I would go. I think there's a finite amount of money I would spend on this risk, even though there's an unquantifiable risk that is as severe as anything you can imagine, and not trivial. It's not the sort of ridiculous Martians come from outer space kind of thing. It's a real risk, but unquantifiable and existential. And I think that I can come up with lots of risks like that. And we'd certainly be glad if we detected an asteroid heading towards the Earth that we had orbital telescopes and nuclear bombs and spacecraft, right? And the fact that we had all this large-scale technological development over the last 400 or 500 years would be crucial to surviving. And I think you can envision lots of different kinds of risks, some of which are sociological, some of which are, biology-based, and so on, such that it's very, very hard to know which of these alternative futures would in fact be resilient against it. Right. And I think that the track record, to date at least, is that wealth and raw material, or wealth and technology are our raw materials for options. That when we need to fashion a response, the richer you are and the more technology you have, the better you're able actually to meet those challenges, and in fact, we should more resilient.
I think I find myself half in agreement and half disagree, which is,
progress.
I read Greg Easterbrook's article in Atlantic, and I think it's certainly a part of human life on Earth, or life on Earth. There have been these catastrophic interruptions, and were we able to prevent that, that'd be a smart thing to do, and we would be willing to pay a lot of money to avoid extinction by impact with an asteroid. On the other hand, we court other risks, and we become, as a German sociologist puts it, Ulrich, a risk society. We create lots of risks that we really don't need to create, and risks that we don't analyze. Several years ago, Bill Joy, the founder of Sun Microsystems, had an article in Wired magazine saying that we shouldn't create, or we ought to have a moratorium on devices that can self-replicate. Now, I'll be agnostic as to whether that's true or not, but I am absolutely convinced that he's right, that we ought to have a debate about that, at least. I mean, if I was a university president or college president, heaven forbid, I would say, hey, well, let's cancel classes and all committee meetings are suspended for the next month while we consider that issue. And I think it has the advantage of being both interesting and really important.
Yep.
And so you're right, the idea of advancing science, and there's nothing I've said or would ever say that would say let's stop science. But the most scientific attitude towards science is to be skeptical about science itself. That's the scientific attitude toward scientific progress.
Yep.
And there's some kinds of knowledge that we desperately need. I would relate that to human health and how we build decent cities and how we prevent war and conflict. There probably are some fields of scientific endeavor we don't need, and that was what Bill Joy was trying to describe.
Right.
And the great issue comes back here is how do you decide those things? And again, my answer is these are problems of governance for which we're not equipped.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, as somebody who started and ran an artificial intelligence software company, I'll tell you that the rhetoric of the danger of AI and its capabilities actually outruns the reality of what we're able to do on the ground. But I totally agree. I read that article, and I agree that the risk he was describing is one that you hated. The issue of governance, I think, is central, right? So you said something I thought was interesting, which is I'd pay a lot of money to avoid an extinction event. And so would I. And in fact, in governance terms, I would suspend democracy, right? I mean, there's almost, it's like Abraham Lincoln, right? I mean, I will free the slaves, that'll save the Union. I'll leave them in bondage, that'll save the Union. I'll leave some in bondage and free others, that'll save the Union. I mean, if the species goes extinct, you have no possibility of ultimately regenerating democracy and so on. So it's such a game-over action that you do almost anything to basically avoid it.
Right.
But I think the key here is one of prediction, right? Because it's not avoid certainty of extinction. It's some unknowable risk, using the term loosely, some risk of extinction. And that's, to me, what makes this such a hard problem and not a kind of table-pounding exercise, but a really difficult problem to manage, and one that, in a different way than you're saying it, I believe can't be isolated. In other words, we have all kinds of potential risks looming on the environment, looming out there on the periphery of our ability to predict. And the problem is our track record in predicting these things is terrible, right? So if as I listen to someone make a prediction for what's going to happen over hundreds of years and what the challenges humanity will face, my basic reaction is typically humanity will face massive challenges over the next several hundred years, but I don't believe we know what they're going to be.
Well, I don't agree with that. And I think the issue here, the book is about climatic change. Mm-hmm. And it's a risk that has been well studied. We do know a lot about this issue, much more than we did, say, 20 or 30 years ago. Although the first warning to a U.S. president about climate change occurred in 1965. Yep. But we know about this risk. It isn't something that's vague and abstract. And we know that if we load the atmosphere with too much carbon dioxide and other heat-trapping gases, that we will court disaster. And it will be not a small disaster. At some point, it becomes a total disaster for civilization. And so that's a risk that is increasingly well known. And we know, too, that as the science has progressed, it typically shows that the situation is worse and more dire than previously thought. That's been the record of science pretty much over the past, climate science, over pretty much the past 10 or 15 years. And so the question then is not what do we do about an unknown risk with a small probability, but in this case, what do we do with a very large risk with an increasingly known set of consequences? And the answer comes back that what we ought to do relative to climate change is what we really ought to do for lots of other reasons as well. We have every reason to pursue energy efficiency. We have every other reason for economics and foreign policy to deploy solar power. So this is not something that is far-fetched. It's not something that is unknown. It's something coming at us, and the science indicates it's much bigger, will last much longer. It's coming at us much faster than we previously thought. Mm-hmm. And
forget.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it's interesting because I believe at least the fundamental scaling parameter here, which is climate sensitivity, has had an estimate which back before the IPCC, like in the I think it was the Charney Commission in '79, for the NSC, it estimated climate sensitivity is about, i.e. the equilibrium change in the equilibrium, but for our audience, the equilibrium change in temperature resulting from the doubling of atmospheric concentration of CO2. Mm-hmm. They estimated it was 3 degrees plus or minus 1.5 degrees, which has been, to my knowledge, exactly the estimate in the first, second, third, and fourth assessment reports. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're not going to resolve this. We're 50 minutes in, and I know we're not going to resolve this debate and this discussion. But I think that it is dangerous to align between, on one hand, here is the estimate of impact and damages that again, I'll use the IPCC as my North Star here, that produces from, there is a risk that we have underestimated our danger. And I think that the damage that we expect to happen through a consensus scientific process is totally different than, hey, we might get hit by an asteroid. But I think the danger that we may have really underestimated again, using the IPCC as a definition for the moment of we, and to your point, potentially an out-of-date version of we, the risk, danger that we have grossly underestimated that impact is actually pretty analogous to these more speculative dangers, because it is this uncertainty. It's a recognition, I think, a legitimate recognition of our lack of comprehensive knowledge, to put it mildly, of the world ecosystem.
Science Magazine published a graphic. It was called the Burning Embers graphic, and it appeared in several different formats and ways. And what it basically depicts is the risk to ecosystems and water and so forth of increases in temperature from 1 to 5 degrees centigrade. And what it shows rather graphically is that what was thought to be risky 5 or 6 or 7 years ago is now believed to be much riskier than had been initially thought. And so, again, I think what we're dealing with is how do we think about governance and decision-making and economics and ethics in a case where non-linearity has global consequences that are effectively permanent.
Right.
And we don't have, at the present time, there's no capacity of foresight in governments. I mean, the great invention, governmental invention, needs to be to integrate foresight, scientific foresight, in with public decision-making. So the way we conduct a public business has got to be informed much more dramatically, much more forcefully by science and sort of a forecasting view of the world. And I think the other thing, that the body called the Elders, which was assembled by Richard Branson, and includes Nelson Mandela and Václav Havel and B. Robinson and so forth, that body also points to the need for foresight, along with a great deal of ethical sensitivity to the disadvantaged and so forth. But these are the two big things I tried to stress in the book, that this is a crisis, first and foremost, of governance and ethics, not primarily economics and technology.
Right. We're highly aligned, actually, on that point. I think we're getting pretty close to an hour, which has gone quickly for me. Maybe it's like a few days to you, but this has been a fascinating conversation. Lisa, maybe the last question I'd ask, just for your take on, is if you look at the actual legislation that is being debated in Congress now, what was Waxman-Markey in the House, I'm sure you're quite conversant with it, and is a Harry Boxer bill in the Senate. Generally speaking, that legislation, do you have a take on that? Do you have a view that's, I'm sure you don't view it as complete, is it a step in the right direction, wrong direction? I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, there are a number of opinions. One opinion is it's the best you're going to get right now. Take it and run and hope to improve it later. The other end of the spectrum is it's not nearly adequate. Stop it. Go back to the drawing boards and put something better on the table. The reality is I think we have to deal with this legislation as it is and get the best deal we can possibly get. The reasons are many. One is that if it's delayed, I don't see it likely that we'll get anything better in the near term. And secondly, the reason for that is that we get into the electoral cycle. Next year is an election year. The year after that, people are running for the presidency, and so it's pretty much, it seems to me, now or never. Is the bill, what's being presented in the House and the Senate, are they adequate? No, not at all. They'll be obsolete the day they're passed.
Right.
But I think the issue is of such overriding importance. I think that we have to act, and once we've acted, I think we'll find something very very clear, that the action we will have taken in whatever the form was not nearly as costly as all the as some people thought it would be. It actually was highly beneficial. It helped to jumpstart a whole new sector of the American economy, and it was a lot less painful. And that experience alone would justify moving ahead with more ambitious steps quickly to follow, as I think will be necessary.
And what do you think? Do you have any prediction for what's going to come out of the International Copenhagen discussions next month?
I think there's a lot of pessimism that will not come out with much of anything. It would take a miracle at this point to get something through. Although there is movement, but I think and there is, of course, the rebellion the last day or two of 50 African nations, quite understandably, that they think they're being disadvantaged by the fact that the Western nations want to create a climate regime, but we're the culprits in the problem. And so we've got a long way to go. And I think that this, again, is an argument for historic leadership. We need leaders to stand up. And I would hope President Obama would do that. And I think that we need something like, I propose something like the speech that Franklin Roosevelt gave after Pearl Harbor, the Day of Infamy speech. I would love to see the president go before the American public with slides or PowerPoint presentation, but explain to the American public, here's the best science understanding of the issue, and here's what we have to do, and enlist the American people in what would be an historic act of leadership. But
Gotcha.
Business as usual takes us over a cliff that is now pretty well charted. We know a good bit about the topography we're moving into. And there is no good scenario beyond some point, whether it's 2 degrees centigrade warming or 2.5 or 3, there is at some point no good scenario. And again, I think the problem we have is that these are nonlinear systems. 2 plus 2 suddenly becomes 8 or 9, or the straw that breaks the camel's back. So it's really a time for incredible leadership at all levels of society, not just the White House.
Great. Well, we did this to discuss your books. I wanted to make sure you had the opportunity at the end to really kind of lay out your point of view on these questions. Great. This is a terrific discussion. I think the one thing we for sure agree on is this is not going to get resolved politically anytime soon, so maybe we'll have an opportunity to get back together.
There'll be lots more to talk about.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time.
Hey, Jim, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
You too. Thanks.